great champion. You got hot. You guys helped too.
One of the most overused words in sports, guys, is incredible. I hate to say it. This is incredible.
Turn your Bible, please, to Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19. It's on page 95 if you're using one of our Bibles. Leviticus 19. We are in a series, a 7-week series called Fighting Fair. This is the middle of the series. We've done 3 talks on this. There'll be 3 more after today. This is number 4. And we're definitely making a shift today that we're changing from looking at just you. We've been talking a lot in the first 3 weeks about looking in the mirror of conflict rather than through the window of conflict, that we're pretty good experts. We're great at using Windex to clean the window between us and the other person, and we can clearly see their problem and their faults and what they've done wrong. We're not very good at cleaning the mirror of our own sins and faults and looking at the mirror of our own lives for conflict, what we've done to make the situation bad or to make it worse. So let me just review. There's a lot of notes today. If you want to grab those notes, this may help you as we think through this series together. Let me just review, though, to get us started. In week number 1, we talked about your goal in conflict cannot be to win the conflict. If your default response to conflict is attack, that can't be your goal. Your goal can also not be to avoid the conflict. Maybe most naturally you go with escape mechanisms for conflict. That can't be it. Your number 1 goal has to be to please God. And that means if most naturally you escape, you shouldn't be escaping. If most naturally you attack, you shouldn't be attacking. Your goal must be to please God. And the reason that's so important is because we're sinners. And as sinners, when we're sinned against, most naturally we're going to sin in response. We say that a lot around here because it's true. And it's because what all of us struggle with on a daily basis. Sinful people tend to respond sinfully when sinned against. That was week number 1. Week number 2, we looked at James chapter 4, where we talked about this. You must focus on your part of the conflict regardless of what the other person does. Here's the reality. James asks the question, what causes all fights and quarrels among you? Don't they happen because of desires that are battling within you? You have desires that are happening within yourself, and those can be good desires, and they're battling against evil desires. Evil desires become evil because they're good desires that God has given us that we allow to become sinful desires. We know they're sinful desires when they take an elevated place in our life above God, and we know it's taken an elevated place in our life above God because when we don't get it, we're willing to sin, so we do get it, usually through manipulation, or we'll sin because we didn't get it. And what we have to recognize is our biggest enemy in conflict is not the person we're fighting against. Our biggest enemy in conflict is ourselves. That's what James chapter 4 tells us. If you want to know why you have a struggle with someone in your life, it's because of a desire that you have that's not being met. If every desire in your heart was being met by the other person, you'd never be in conflict with them, would you? You wouldn't. The reason you're in conflict is because you have desires in your heart that aren't being met. So you got to recognize that your biggest enemy in conflict is you. Last week then we looked at forgiveness, that humbly asking for forgiveness is the most powerful relational remedy in conflict. So we talked about there's a big difference between an apology and asking for forgiveness. There's a big difference between an apology and asking for forgiveness. An apology is used for accidental, non-sinful issues. When you bump into someone in the hallway, when you don't do something when you don't do something well that you tried to do well, you use forgiveness when, whether it's accidental or not, it's sinful. If you've sinned, an apology is never enough. If you've sinned, an apology is never enough. You need to ask forgiveness. It's a lot harder. I'm sorry is easy. I've sinned against you. Will you forgive me is very hard. An apology is used. Use an apology. Don't ask for forgiveness when for human weakness. There's things you're not good at that you wish you were better at, and other people would like you to be better at it. If it's not a sin issue, you don't need to seek forgiveness that you're not good at that. Apologize. I'm sorry. I wish I were better at that. You don't seek forgiveness for personality differences. You don't seek forgiveness for differences of perspective. We tend to be pretty prideful, and the way we look at something, we're convinced everyone should look at it that same way. But if you look at something differently than someone else, that needs an apology. Maybe, I'm sorry we don't see it the same way, but it doesn't need forgiveness. You also don't need forgiveness when you try something and you fail. Those are all things you apologize for. But whenever sin is involved, whether it's intentional or unintentional, if you sin against someone else, that needs more than an apology. That needs forgiveness. So that's what we've talked about the first 3 weeks. But if you could do those well, if you can not go for escape responses or attack responses, instead if you can make the goal of your relational conflict to please God, if you could clearly recognize that sinful people tend to respond sinfully when sinned against, therefore you've got to tread carefully when there's issues of conflict, when there's those feelings of conflict that come up. If you do that, your relationships will improve. If you could recognize that any conflict you have is because of an unfulfilled desire of your heart, and if that conflict becomes sinful, it's because that desire of your heart has taken a sinful place in your life, and the biggest enemy in conflict that you have is not that person, it's you. If you can recognize that and live out that reality, your relationships will improve. If you can begin to be one who humbly asks for forgiveness, whether the other person does or not, your relationships will improve every single time. So the first three talks of this series is all that you need to know for all of your relationships to improve. But here's the other part of that reality. It doesn't just end with you. That we aren't the only ones that need to respond well in conflict. Other people do too. And sometimes God calls us to get involved with that other person that's making bad choices. So we're going to look in Leviticus in just a second, but let me show you a verse that we'll come back to a few times today. It's Galatians 6, 1 and 2, where it says this: brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, so this is a sin issue. This is not a personality issue. This is not a perspective issue. This is not a human weakness or a human failing. This is sin. If they do something that God says not to do. If someone sins, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. That is our responsibility. So there's times we don't just look in the mirror of conflict. We have to look through the window of conflict because people that are sinning need to be restored, and it needs to be done gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So we've been talking about us. What do we need to do in conflict? And today we turn it and look at what about others? Are there things we are supposed to do with them when they're in conflict with us or with other people? So today's talk is how to avoid a fight and do what's right. What I mean by doing what's right is Galatians 6, helping others that have sinned, whether they've sinned against you or sinned against other people. Our tendency is to think this, that if we have to talk to someone about a way they've sinned, it's going to be a fight. There's going to be a conflict. This cannot go well. And I want to suggest there are ways that it can go well. So let's start in Leviticus 19. I just want to show you a couple things here, and then we're going to jump into a bunch of other scripture. Leviticus 19. So we've been talking about our part of the conflict, but is there a place to talk to someone else about their sins? Is there a place to talk to the other people about how they're handling this problem? And there is. So Leviticus 19, part of the law of Moses given to the Israelites. And this section in Leviticus 19 is about interpersonal relationships. So for now, I want you to notice verses 17 and 18. It says this: do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, before that and after that, the law of Moses gives several laws of handling interpersonal relationships. But if we're to narrow down these interpersonal relationships, I think it comes down to two statements, and it's in those two verses, but let me show it to you. The summary of this section about interpersonal relationships is, number one, don't hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Instead, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this was the law given to the Israelites. We're not Israelites. So we look at it as our neighbor. I think this can help us think through this. Don't hate a fellow Israelite or a neighbor, someone with whom you have a relationship, is Jesus' definition of neighbor, someone that God brings across your path. But instead, love your neighbor as yourself. And then the reason I am the Lord, and that word Lord with all capital letters, is the name for God that's the covenant-keeping God. He has a covenant with his people. And as having a covenant with his people, here's what you need to do, because he's a covenant-keeping God who will keep his promises, and here's what he wants from you. And to summarize all these relational commands, two things. Don't hate, love. Don't hate, love. And then around those two commands, he gives several examples of active hate and examples of passive hate. So let me show you these. Look at verse 15. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. So an act of active hate would be to intentionally pervert justice. That's how you hate your neighbor. You could do it more passively, though, by doing this, showing partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great. That's not active hatred, but it's passive hatred, because you're favoring someone else over somebody else. You're favoring someone simply because they're poor. Or you're favoring someone simply because they're rich. All of us have this tendency either to show favoritism to people with a lot of money or favoritism to the poor. One of the two. And when we do that, it's an act of passive hatred. We're not to do that. That's perverting justice because of their economic status or physical appearance or race or ethnicity or doctrinal differences. Verse 16, do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. And the reason, again, this statement, I am the Lord. When you gossip, when you speak poorly of someone else to others who's not part of the problem or not part of the solution, that's a moment of active hatred. It's not loving. It doesn't build character. It destroys reputations. Then he describes it this way on the other extreme, not just protecting their reputation, but protecting their very lives. Don't do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. Why? I am the Lord. Then we come to verse 17. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. Now, I think this is really important. And this is the reason that I'm starting with this passage. Do not hate a fellow Israelite. Do not hate your neighbor in your heart. And then what is the first command that he gives to prove that you don't hate? The first command is rebuke your neighbor frankly. The first command to show that you're not hating is rebuking others who are sinning. Have you ever thought about that? That a sign of love is actually to rebuke or to confront others. Then verse 18, don't seek revenge, bear a grudge against anyone among your people, love your neighbor as yourself. And again, why? I am the Lord. So if you really love your neighbor, that's your spouse, your child, your friend, your coworker, it means you rebuke or correct or confront. And this is an emphasis throughout the Bible. Let me show you other places beyond Leviticus 19. Proverbs 27. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. Do you know what this is saying? This is saying if you have a friend who's a good friend, who never tells you anything you do wrong, who never challenges you when you do anything, who never says, I think you should rethink that, I don't know if you handled that the right way, that's not a friend at all, that's an enemy. Proverbs 28 says this, whoever rebukes a person in the end will gain more favor than the one who has a flattering tongue. Or Proverbs 9, do not rebuke mockers or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise and they will love you. How you handle confrontation when someone confronts you will say whether you're a mocker or a fool or wise. Now don't get the wrong idea. Nobody loves to be confronted, right? None of you, when someone says, you know, you did something the other day, we got to talk about it because I think it was wrong. None of you say, oh, thank you, let's talk, I can't wait, right? You're like, oh no, this is going to be painful. But how you handle that correction says whether you're a mocker or a fool, or whether you're wise. James chapter 5 says this, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this, whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. This is something we are to be doing. And then the verse we started with, Galatians 6 again, where it says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, they're trapped by it, you who live by the Spirit, those who have God living within them that are trying to obey what God's Spirit is saying within us, should restore that person gently, but watch yourselves. Be careful, because you could be tempted to sin in that very same way or another way. Here's the reality. That we've been talking for 3 weeks about looking at the window or looking at the mirror at our part of the conflict, where there comes a time where God commands us to look through the window of conflict and see what the other person is doing. And there are times that we must confront, that we must rebuke, that we must say the hard thing. So today we want to talk about that. How to confront, how to rebuke others, but to do it in a way that doesn't result in a fight. Now, some of you think, oh, I've been waiting for this. This is great. This is what I've been waiting for. Listen, if you've been sitting through the first three and we're talking a lot about here's what you need to do, here's what you need to do, if you discovered yourself saying, boy, I hope my spouse is listening to this because this is what they need, then you're looking through the window, not the mirror. If when talking about those first 3 weeks, all you're thinking about is, I wish they would do this, I hope they listen to this, I hope they hear this, then you're not looking in the mirror, you're looking through the window. And successful biblical confrontation is probably less likely to go well for you. If you're also, let me give you another warning, if you're a person that you kind of enjoy confronting, you kind of say, this is great, yeah, someone needs to confront, I'll do it, bring it on. I like this. Then if you enjoy confrontation, you probably should never do it, ever. In fact, Proverbs 20, verse 3 talks about you. It says this, it is to one's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel. If you're quick to fight, if you're quick to quarrel, that says something about you. So if you're one who's anxious, come on, let's bring it on, let's do it, then this is probably not something that you need to do readily and quickly. But know this, for most of us that don't enjoy confrontation, here's what's really important to know. Biblical confrontation is a difficult necessity for every Christ follower. Biblical confrontation is a difficult necessity for every Christ follower. It is not easy. This is a difficult command. And biblical confrontation is really, it's at the intersection of loving a person and hating their sin. Biblical confrontation lives at the intersection of loving someone and hating their sin. Because I love you, I'm not going to let you run away. Because I love you, I can't ignore what you're doing. Because I love you, I won't just let this go. And biblical confrontation, although incredibly difficult, it is very difficult. It's a difficult necessity. Although it's difficult, it is one of the most loving things that you can do. So how do you do it? When do you do it? And how do you do it? I'm saying you could do it without a fight. I think you can. I don't think it's easy, but if you'll focus on this today and some of the scriptures that we talk about and some of the tips I want to try to give you, I think you can learn to confront someone else. How do you know when you should confront them, and how do you do it to avoid a fight? So what I want to talk about is 3 steps when you need to confront someone. When there's a conflict, steps to take when in conflict. There's 3 of them. They're in your notes. You might want to write these down. Number 1, deal with your part of the conflict first. We've been talking about this for 3 weeks, so I don't need to keep going over this. But if you want to successfully deal with conflict with someone that you're in conflict with, you've got to deal with your part of the conflict first. So before you go to them to talk to them, you have to make 100% sure that you've dealt with 100% of your part of the problem. And I don't care how small of a part of a problem you think you have. You might bear 1% of the problem for the situation that has come up. Or you may have responded sinfully and it was all theirs, but you responded sinfully. You have to deal with 100% of your part of the conflict first. And I don't care how small of a percentage that is. You must deal with your part first, or this is not going to go well. Which is why last week we talked about the 7 A's of confession. And maybe this list of 7 A's was just a huge, intimidating list to you. And some of you probably thought, that is ridiculous. Who would do that? I'll tell you who would do that. Those that are committed to having good relationships with people they love. And people that think a list like this is absolutely ridiculous probably have conflict in their life. And I recognize this is just a list. You don't have to follow these exact steps, but if you do, your relationships will improve. So you address everyone involved. Private sin, private confession. Public sin, public confession. If I sin against one person privately, I confess privately. If I sin against a person, but it's in front of a group of people, I need to address everyone that saw that or heard that. Avoid if, but, and maybe. Avoid those words, and your confession will go better. As soon as you say if, but, or maybe if you had, they lose everything you've said, and you may mean it sincerely, but they won't hear it. Admit specifically, what exactly did you do? I had an elementary teacher this morning tell me that in front of her 4th grade class, she's gone over the 7 A's of confession, and she's making them do it. I'm sure they're very confused right now, but it's good for them. Man, she's finding this is helpful for them in dealing with relationships with each other. Admit specifically, what exactly did you do wrong? Acknowledge the hurt. Acknowledge how painful that was. If they feel that you understand what they feel, it mends relationships. Accept the consequences. Sometimes there's consequences, and you're willing to to own those consequences. Forgiveness doesn't mean lack of consequence. Alter your behavior. I've got to change. Here's how I want to change. By God's grace, here's what I want to do differently, and ask for forgiveness. It's so easy to say I'm sorry. It's so difficult to say, will you forgive me? So, if you have conflict, here's the first step you take. You got to deal with your part of the conflict first. If you chase after their part of the conflict first, then you'll handle your part. It's rarely going to go well. Deal with 100% of your part of the problem. Number 2, overlook what you can when you can. Overlook what you can when you can. This is the best way I can help you to have good relationships with people with whom you're in conflict. Overlook what you can when you can. Every chance you get, overlook their faults. So the Bible's full of commands saying we need to confront, we need to help someone in sin, but it's also say we should overlook their sin against us. Let me show you some of those places. Proverbs 19, verse 11. A person's wisdom yields patience. It's to one's glory to overlook an offense. 1 Peter 4:8. Above all, love each other deeply. Why? Because love covers over a multitude of sins. Proverbs chapter 10. Hatred stirs up conflict. Love covers over all wrongs. In Proverbs 17. Whoever would foster love covers over an offense. Whoever would foster love covers over an offense. But whoever repeats the matter separates close friends. So there's all these commands in Scripture saying we need to confront, we have to gently confront. There's other commands saying we need to overlook, we need to overlook. How do we decide? We'll talk about that. But how is it possible to confront in a successful way? How is it possible to overlook what you can when you can? Here's what I think. I think there are 3 types of people that are good at overlooking the faults of others. Let me point these out, and you can see if you're a person that you're not quick to notice problems in other people, you're not quick to criticize, you're not quick to be offended. 1 or 2 or all 3 of these things are true of you. You can see which ones. Number 1, those who overlook the faults most easily are patient people. Patient people are incredibly good at overlooking the faults of others. Proverbs 19:11, again, a verse I showed earlier. A person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Here's the reality. Wise people are patient people. And patient people overlook annoyances from other people. Patient people are quick to forgive. Patient people are quick to understand. Patient people show that they realize that sin is one they could commit to. They're patient with others. It takes a long time to get them to be hurt and offended. I admire patient people. If you're a patient person, you overlook others' faults pretty easily. Second type of person that overlooks the faults of others easily is godly people. The reason a godly person is simply one who imitates God. If you imitate God, God is full of patience. God is full of forgiveness. In fact, a great verse to think about imitating God when it comes to overlooking the offenses of others is Psalm 103, 8 through 10, where it says this: The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. He will not always accuse, nor will he harbor his anger forever. He does not treat us as our sins deserve. He does not repay us according to our iniquities. This is who God is. Godly people imitate God. So if in your relationships you imitate God, that means you're compassionate and gracious. When people hurt you, you're slow to anger. You're full of love for them. You don't accuse. You don't hold things against them. You're not angry with them. You don't treat them as their sins deserve to be treated. And you don't try to pay them back. You don't have revenge on them. Godly people tend to overlook the offenses of others. So patient people overlook people's offenses. Godly people are quick to overlook the offenses of others. A third kind of person that does it is humble people. Humble people overlook the faults of others easily. The reason is they're not proud. They don't look at it necessarily as an offense against them. They're understanding of someone else and very humble about their own sin and their own faults and their own brokenness. A verse that's been meaningful to me years and years ago, I ran across this verse, it probably was 20 years ago, and I thought, how come I've never seen that verse before? And it's a verse that I decided I needed to memorize because of how true it needed to be for me. And if you're one who's easily hurt and easily offended, maybe it's a verse you should memorize. It's from Ecclesiastes 7, where it says this: Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. And why should you not pay attention when people speak bad about you? For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. That's a humble person that looks at life that way. That when someone hurts them, they're humble enough to say, I see my own sinfulness. I see that I've sinned in this same way, or even if I haven't sinned in the same way they've sinned against me, I've sinned against God and other people in different ways. A humble person. So, who overlooks the faults of others most easily? I think of three groups of people: patient people, godly people, humble people. If you think every time someone does something wrong against you, you got to chase it down, and obviously there's friction that happens in the relationship, and every time you hurt someone's feelings, they can tell they've done something, and they tiptoe around you because of that, that tells me there's probably a lot of pride. There certainly isn't patience with them, and you're not acting like God for sure. So, the Bible commands two things that seem to be diametrically opposed. The Bible commands us to confront, that when someone is in sin, we got to pull them back. We have to restore them. The Bible also commands us overlook. Well, which is it? Well, I would suggest that it depends on the situation. How do you know when you shouldn't overlook? How do you know when you can't overlook? I want to suggest 6 questions. These are in your notes. 6 questions that might give you a starting place on whether it's time to not overlook a sin, but to confront a sin. Here's the 6 questions. Number 1, do you talk about the situation, how hurt you are, what they've done? If you find yourself talking about it, that's a parameter. You probably need to talk to them about it. Number 2, when you shouldn't overlook an issue, has it damaged your relationship with them? You haven't talked about it, or you've barely addressed it, and it's changed the nature of your relationship. That must be talked about. Number 3, do you find yourself thinking about it days or weeks later? You're not choosing to dwell on it, but it's there. It's in your mind. You're thinking about it. You're reviewing it. You're having that pretend conversation over and over and over. You don't want to think about it. You try not to think about it, but it's just there. If that's happening, you can't overlook. Number 4, have they brought dishonor to God? There are certain sins that damage the reputation of God and His church and Christians. And if by their sin, remember this is a sin issue, not a personality or perspective issue. If by their sin they are causing damage to the reputation of God, it is your responsibility to confront it. Number 5, is it hurting others? Is what they've done, they don't even see it, but they're running over people. And it's hurting other people, it's damaging them and their relationship with God, perhaps. That needs to be confronted. They don't even see what they're doing to someone else. And then finally, is it hurting them? They don't even see it, but it's hurting them. Maybe it's the amount of alcohol they're consuming, or they're putting things in their body that are damaging their body, and they're not even aware of it or thinking about it. They're making choices that are hurting them. Or they're in a dating relationship that's wrong, it's hurting them, and they don't even see it. If it's hurting them and they don't see it, then you need to step up and say, this is not one that I overlook. This is not simply a sin against me that I can't overlook. This is a sin of damaging God's reputation or hurting other people, or it's hurting themselves. So how do you do it? If the first step, when you think about when you're in these difficult things, there's 3 steps, right? 3 steps when you're in conflict. Number 1, deal with your part of the conflict. Number 2, overlook what you can when you can. And this goes along with the first half of this series. Look in the mirror of conflict. Don't look through the window first. Look at the mirror first. Then the third one is looking through the window, and that is this: confront gently. You got to do it gently. Gently confront other people. And it must be done with gentleness. Let me show you Galatians 6 again. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, remember we're talking sin here. We're not talking about personality. We're not talking about perspective. We're not talking about human weakness or human failure. We're talking about sin. If someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. Second warning, but watch yourselves or you also may be tempted. You need to do it gently. Carry their burden. They've sinned. They're broken. They have offended God and offended others. You need to carry their burden with them and help them. That tells us what we're to do, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how to do it. So how are we to do that? Matthew 18 gives us a little more instruction. If your brother or sister sins, we're going to look at this more closely in a couple weeks. Go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. So in talking about confronting, don't do it publicly, do it one-on-one, and do it in a loving, careful way. We'll talk more about that. But conflict just sounds difficult. It sounds violent. Confrontation sounds combative, but it doesn't need to be. It needs to be done in love, and it needs to be done gently. Why? Well, it needs to be done gently because of Romans 12:18. Where it says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So I want to try to teach you a way to confront others that you can do it gently, that you can do it with love and care, that it can bring peace, not friction. Our tendency is to think, if I confront someone, it's going to make our relationship worse. It shouldn't. Now, there's a lot of bad ways to confront, and I've done too many of them. But there are good ways to confront. This doesn't need to go badly. In fact, I love Proverbs 12:18, where it says this: "The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." You see, here's our tendency. That we've been hurt by someone, but instead of dealing with our part of the conflict first and overlooking what we can, we come into the confrontation angry. And when we come in angry, we use reckless words that pierce. We got to slow down and choose to confront gently, because when it's done gently, the tongue of the wise brings healing. See, according to the book of Proverbs, you could be wise or a fool based on how you act when people confront you, and you could be wise or a fool based on how you act when you confront others. So confrontation, it doesn't need to be full of strife. It doesn't need to be full of conflict. So when you talk to others about their conflict, your words will either be full of hurt and handicap your relationship, or your words will be full of help and it will heal the relationship. It's going to be one of the two. Either your words are going to be full of hurt and it's going to make your relationship worse, it's going to handicap your relationship, or it's going to be words of healing and it's only going to help your relationship. So, how do we do that? I want to suggest to you 3 letters. The letters are OIC, and I give those letters to help you remember. OIC, oh, I see, right? Okay, that's going to help you remember it. OIC. You have a difficult relationship, just think, oh, I see. That's what you want to happen, right? You want to talk to them and have them say, oh, I see what you're saying. So OIC. Here's what those letters stand for. I hope you remember this. O stands for observation. When it comes to confronting someone else, it starts with observation. This is the facts and only the facts. This is not your opinion. This is not your personal interpretation. There should be no arguments when you share your observations, because your observations are indisputable. Everyone that saw it, everyone that heard it knows this is what happened. In fact, your observations need to be so crystal clear that even the person you're confronting won't disagree with the facts. They might say, well, here's why I did that. Or they might say, but here's what happened first. I get all that. We're only talking, here's the facts. There may be facts you don't know, but the facts you share are true. OIC, it's got to start with observation. This needs to be indisputable. There's no argument there. The I is interpretation. This is where you're saying, here are the facts that we agree on. Here's how I interpret those facts. Here's what I assume based on what you said and what you did. Here's what you're communicating to me. To me, when you did that, here's what that said to me. Here's what I assume you were thinking, or here's what it made me think. This is where it takes humility. When you confront, this is facts. This is my interpretation of those facts, which means I have an interpretation of those facts, and you may have a different interpretation of those same facts. Someone who humbly confronts recognizes that I interpret these facts one way, they may interpret them another way. The other benefit of using interpretation, of saying, this is how I interpret this, is when you say this is my interpretation, that indicates that my interpretation could be wrong. Humbly confronting comes with the attitude of, here's what I saw, here's what I experienced, here's my interpretation of why you did what you did. I'm looking into motives here. I'm looking into it deeper than just the facts. And here's what I think is going on. And then it ends with C, confirmation. And confirmation is where you say, simply you ask a question. The question might be this: is that true? Do I have that right? What am I missing? How can you help me see this differently? This is a humble way of approaching people that you're in conflict with. Observation. Here's the facts, the facts, the facts. It's only the facts. It's indisputable. Here's my interpretation of those facts. It's my interpretation. You may have a different interpretation, and I'm open to your interpretation. So confirm. Tell me what I got right. Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me how I should view this differently. Please help me. Let me try to give you some examples. So imagine this. Let's take your house, or let me just give you a fictional house, a husband and wife and 2 children. And dinner did not go well, and Dad was extremely impatient and raised his voice, and it made the whole table quiet, and you could feel the tension. The kids go upstairs to do their homework, so the wife says to the husband, you were being a jerk, and the way you responded to the kids was wrong, and you need to apologize to them tonight. That was wrong. Now, what she just did might be true, but I just wonder how much more effective it might be if she followed an OIC approach. What if she, instead of just making her final conclusion, what you did was wrong, you were out of control, that needs to be apologized for immediately? What if instead she said this? Honey, can we talk about tonight a little bit? During dinner, you got upset. You raised your voice last night and tonight at dinner. And not only that twice, little Jake was trying to get your attention and you were kind of zoned out, so I tapped you so you could talk to him. Do you remember that? And then at the end of the meal, when we started cleaning up, Susie didn't start helping right away, and you got upset and really raised your voice at her. Observation. She observed what everybody in the room observed, and that he knows is true himself. Then she moves to interpretation, and this is where she takes an extremely humble approach. And she says, it seems to me that dinner used to be just the most fun thing in our family, but it's gotten pretty tense the last few days. It seems maybe the stress at work maybe is bleeding over to here, and I'm just guessing the way you're responding to the kids probably isn't how you want to respond. And I want to help. Interpretation and confirmation. Am I right? What am I missing? How can I help? Tell me what I got wrong. Now, you just help me. Come on, this is obvious, right? Which one of those two is going to go better? Do you know what's easier is to get mad and say, I can't believe you treated the kids like that. You need to go apologize. Oh, you feel so much better. When you attack someone, when you're sinned against, you feel better. When you take an OIC approach, it takes humility, it takes skill, it takes practice, but it always goes better. Would you try this kind of approach? Why does that go better? Why does it go better? Well, it goes better because of Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. It's just a wise approach to someone who has sinned and trying to gently draw them back. Let me give you another example. Let's say it's a work example, and you have a boss who's a Christ follower. So you call for a meeting with your boss, and you say, I got a really difficult conversation. You can give me just a couple minutes to walk through this. And in your mind, you're thinking OIC. You've planned it out, and here's what you say. There's been a couple of situations that have happened over the last couple of weeks that I just felt like I had to, as your brother in Christ, we both want to follow Christ. We'd love our coworkers to follow Christ with us. There's a couple of things that happen I'd just like to ask you about. So you're taking a humble approach. You're admitting beforehand. It might be your interpretation. So there's two issues that I think of. One is a couple weeks ago with this particular client. They called me and talked to me about this particular software, and the memo had gone out the day before saying, we are no longer servicing this software. We're done. And so I told the client that, and they ended up getting a hold of you, and you took the client from me, which is absolutely your right as my boss. But then they emailed me saying, hey, your boss is going to service this. And I just, from that memo that was sent out yesterday, we're not servicing that product. And that's one point. The second point is you told our team on Friday you were taking a long weekend so you weren't going to be in Monday. You weren't in on Monday. But the problem is the boss came through while we were in our meeting and said, hey, I don't know if you guys heard, but he called in sick. Your boss called in sick. And then you say, okay, so that's the facts, interpretation. I just got to tell you, I think that makes you look bad. I think everybody kind of looked at each other like, boy, that was interesting. You knew we were going to be sick on Friday. And I just think, I don't think that's who you probably want to be, and I don't think that's what you probably want to communicate to the guys in the office. And I might have some things wrong. I might be missing some things, and I want you to fill in the empty pieces for me. There's some gaps here that don't make sense to me. Can you help me look at this differently? That's OIC, observation, interpretation, confirmation. When it's done humbly, when it's done gently, it is incredibly powerful. And what it does is it allows you to obey all of these passages. It allows you to obey Galatians 6, where it says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit, restore that person gently. Gently. It helps you obey Matthew 18. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. Point it out, but do it gently. Just the two of you. Don't go public on this. Don't embarrass them. Helps you obey Proverbs 12. The words of the reckless pierce like swords. The tongue of the wise brings healing. And it helps you obey Romans 12:18, where it says, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So let me end with this. Let me just end with 10 tips on confrontation. And something that's not on here. Let me mention this. Someone asked me a question between services. Your approach here is going to be a little bit different if you're confronting a follower of Christ versus someone who doesn't claim to follow Christ. You've got to be aware of that. Someone who is following Christ, it's a lot easier because they have the same goal as you. They have the same authority as you. You better think twice before you confront someone who doesn't follow Christ. Think twice before you confront someone who doesn't follow Christ because they don't have a standard of right and wrong. Their standard is perhaps their own morality. And so I would just warn you, are there times to confront someone who's far from God? Sure, of course. But way less often than someone who claims to follow Christ. Someone who doesn't follow Christ, they have no allegiance to him. The expectations are different. So, okay, 10 tips. Here we go. You want to confront well, plan your words. Don't wing it. Practice. Practice over and over and over. Plan out your words. Don't make accusatory exaggerations. Don't use words like you never or you always. Plan your words. Think through OIC. What's fact? Keep it only on the facts. Then say, here's what I interpret. And then confirmation. That outline can help you. Plan your words. Number 2, talk in person. Don't do this by phone. Don't confront by email. I don't have to tell you not to confront by text, right? You know that? Good. Talk face to face. If you want it to go well, talk face to face. Number 3, remember there may be some facts you are missing. This is all about humility here. Don't be so proud to think you know everything. Observe, interpret, confirm. Confirmation is the way of saying, there's some things I'm sure I don't know. Here's what you got to remember. You want to confront with a humble attitude, know this. The thing they did, the thing they said made sense to them, right? They wouldn't have done it if they didn't think it made sense. It might be sinful, but there's a reason they did it. It made sense, and there may be some facts you don't know. So approach it humbly. You are not the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. Approach it humbly. Number 4, make sure you listen carefully. Listen very carefully. Give the OIC, observe, interpret, confirm, then listen. If you don't listen, you're a fool. Proverbs 18:13 says this, to answer before listening, that is folly and shame. So listen. You can't agree with everything, but listen. Be respectful. Try to hear what they're saying. Try to see things from their perspective. Even doing that verbally, that must have been hard. I could see why you said that. Oh, that makes sense. That'd be incredible. It doesn't mean they're right, but you're listening. If you can listen in an active way, that helps. Number 5, choose the time and place carefully, right? Just use wisdom here. This is crucial. Don't do it in public. Don't do it right after a difficult moment. Don't do it right after a confrontation. Choose the time and place carefully. When is the best time that you're in the best state of mind and you think they'll be in the best state of mind? Choose it carefully. Number 6, be agreeable. As often as you can, agree with what you can when you can. Agree with what they say. When they say something, if you can agree with it, agree with it. It's simple phrases like, oh, I see why you said that. I see what you were thinking. That makes sense. It doesn't mean you're agreeing with, it might still be sinful, but you're agreeing with their interpretation. That makes sense. I understand that had to be incredibly, incredibly hard. The goal here in confrontation is not to fight. The goal is not to win some argument. The goal is to restore. The goal is to be agreeable. Don't fight every single issue. Agree with what you can. See their side when you can. I see what you're saying. That makes sense. Number 7, keep it simple. This shouldn't, unless there's a major conflict between you, unless there's a continuous major conflict between you, or this is a huge issue, this should not be an hour-long conversation. You could do OIC very briefly and quickly, and then you can move on and let God work inside of them. Sometimes we feel like it's our job at that moment to convince them of this. Keep it simple. OIC and then be done. Give them a break. We'll talk about giving them some time. I remember years ago we had, there was a 6-month, they came out with a special deal. I got a call from Time Warner Cable offering cable at this huge discounted amount, so I went for it. 6 months later, the price went up, so I got out. And I called them and said, hey, the price went up. I was hoping they'd keep it low. They didn't. So I said, yeah, I want to cancel. And I went down to what at that time was the $7 cable. So it was like, 10 or 12 channels. It was $7 at the time. It's probably about double that now. So I did that. My bill went down, but I still had ESPN. And they didn't change my channels. I still got all those channels of what was the $40 or $50 version. And I was loving it. And I mentioned it to a friend in passing, and a few days later, that friend just did this very simply. He just said, I don't know, what do you think? Is it right for you to only be paying $7 but getting $40 worth? Don't you think you should do something about that? And I said, I kind of looked at it like winning the lottery, no? He didn't look at it that way. And he just simply said, I don't know, think about it. It's up to you. Well, I thought about it, and it convicted me, and so I called them, and I said, hey, listen, I'm paying the $7, but you're giving me the $40 worth or whatever it was. And here's what the guy said on the phone. I'm confused why you're calling me. And you know what I said? Me too. And then it took, so I explained it to them, and they said, oh, okay, so you want us to change that? I said, well, yeah, you probably should. And it seemed like it took them a couple months, so I kind of enjoyed that 2 more months. But then the day came, and ESPN was gone. And so I tell you, that was a good friend. That was a good friend to say something difficult, but to say it in a kind way. And so I finally said, hey, I wanted to talk to you. He said, so did you call him? I said, I did. After football season, I called him. No, I didn't say it. But now I go over to his house every time there's something I want to watch on ESPN. I keep him up late and eat all his food. It works great. So, okay, anyway, number 8. Dialogue, don't lecture. Dialogue, don't lecture. Don't make declarations, have a conversation. Don't make declarations, have a conversation. Allow for feedback. Don't treat them like you're their parent scolding them. Dialogue, that takes humility on your part. Number 9, remember the goal. The goal is restoration. The goal is for you to please God. The goal is to help them see what their heart might be hardened a little bit to seeing. Make sure you keep the goal in mind. If your goal is winning, don't confront. Your goal must be to please God. Your ultimate goal must be to please God. Your goal with them must be to restore them. But it's not necessarily your job. It's God's ultimate job. And then number 10, give them time. You've been thinking about it. You know what you want to say, your plan. They're not ready for this. And no matter how gently you approach it, they will be defensive. No matter how kind you are, they will feel attacked initially because this is new to them. So give them time. It may take them a few minutes. It may take them a few hours. It may take them a few days. But God can use it and let God play his role. You don't need to play the role of God in their life. Maybe they've never had somebody do this kindly and gently. And if you ignore their sin, then they love it because they keep getting to do what they're doing. If you attack them in their sin, then they feel justified in their response. But a gentle, loving approach might be new to them. And I got to tell you, it's a lot easier to use escape mechanisms because it's just easier. It's easier to use attack mechanisms in conflict because it just makes you feel better. But if you want to please God, then you have to do the hard thing. And I want to encourage you to put on humility and practice this. In summary, the ultimate principle is this. When you confront with love and gentleness, and here's why. Because every conflict provides you with an opportunity to please God, and every conflict provides you with an opportunity to love others. The question is, are you willing to walk this difficult, humble journey? And if you do it well, God will use you to restore others. And in the process, you'll grow to look and act more like Jesus. God, help us. Help us to be people who are humble and approach such difficult matters with love and grace and gentleness for your glory and for our good and the good of those we love. In Jesus' name, amen. If you're new to Northridge, a couple things I want to say. That you are surrounded by a group of people at Northridge whose lives have been radically transformed by the love of God. And God loves us so much that he doesn't want to leave us where we are. He wants to do something in our lives. And the Bible is, hopefully you could tell whether this is your first week or you've been here a few months, we believe the Bible's just full of practical wisdom in how to negotiate life, even difficult relationships in life. So it's full of advice on things like conflict. But here's what you got to know. This is especially important if you're new to Northridge or new to the Bible. Is that the Bible doesn't give us all these tips as moral hoops we have to jump through so that God loves us. God gives us these moral guidelines because he does love us. And the Bible was given to us for a couple of reasons. One is so that we could come to know God through Jesus. And the second reason is so that we could know how to please him. Because you want to please those you love. But here's the great thing about the God who loves us, is he never gives us guidance and rules and standards as some kind of moral hoops to jump through to prove something. When God gives us a command, he gives it to us because he loves us so ferociously, and it's best for us. That's the cool thing. The very things that God gives us to please him are also the very things that are best for us. So if you're new to Northridge, just know this. The very reason we exist as a church is to help you take your next step in your journey towards Christ. And that's true whether this whole thing of God in the Bible is new to you or you've been walking with Jesus for decades. We want to help you take your next step closer to him. So we want to help however we can. After our service, one of our pastors, Andy, will be down front. He'd love to talk to you, pray with you. You may hear a talk like today and think, whoa, that's different than anything I've ever heard. I need to process this with someone. He'd love to talk to you, pray with you, find someone, whether it's he takes a few minutes there, find someone that you can meet with to help you. That's why we're here. So if there's a way we can help you in your spiritual journey, take your next step in your walk towards Christ, let us know. We'd love to help you. Let's pray together. God, thank you for the hope that we have because of Jesus. Thank you that it helps us not just with our future, but with here and now. So God, for your glory and our good, help us to live the reality of the difficult need to confront at times, to help others. Help us to do it with gentleness and love. And may you do great things in difficult relationships this week. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. God bless you.